SQL Server can be configured to allow users to authenticate to it in a couple of different ways, and the way we set these is through the SQL Server Authentication Modes, and you need to understand these. You're going to be asked about this when the SQL Server is installed, and at any time you can go in and change this. Now you have two choices when we start to think about how we're going to allow users of the databases to connect to SQL Server and access those databases. The first mode is called Windows Authentication. It does just what it sounds like. The second one is something called Mixed Mode Authentication. So let's drill into each of these and see what they're about. The first one is Windows Authentication. Now, in Windows Authentication, we're actually going to, first of all, set SQL Server in Windows Authentication mode, and then we actually, through SQL Server, go out there and just choose specific users, and the best way to do this, the Microsoft recommended way, is to point to your Windows groups, and you're basically going to trust them. You're going to mark them as trusted by SQL Server. Then anybody that's a member of that group, since they've already been authenticated by Windows, so all your authentication is actually handled by Windows, by your Active Directory, Kerberos, and all that stuff. So since we know that this user has already logged into Windows successfully, they've been authenticated there, we now trust them in SQL Server, and they can just move into SQL Server. This allows them to get to the SQL Server box. Now, in every individual database, we will have to grant them permission and then let them use whatever objects to whatever level we would like. Now, in this scenario of Windows Authentication, no passwords are sent across the network. Why? Well, because we're really not authenticating this person, because they've already been previously authenticated via their Windows authentication when they logged on to the domain. So no passwords are sent across the network. This is the most secure option for getting users onto SQL Server. And almost anything you read out there in Microsoft's documentation is going to tell you that SQL Server Authentication mode that is suggested, that is the best option, that's the Microsoft recommendation, and all that is Windows Authentication. There's only one problem with that. There's a lot of database apps out there that are running that all of our end users don't have Windows accounts, and so that's not going to work for those users. In that instance, we're going to use mixed mode authentication. So I have users who need to connect to my SQL Server and use the data, but they're not part of my Windows Active Directory domain. Well, with mixed mode authentication, we can still do the Windows authentication. Your Windows accounts can be trusted, but we can also use SQL Server specific logins. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into SQL Server and we're going to create users and give them passwords, and these are going to be stored in SQL Server. Now, a Windows user account is not required. When a user tries to connect to SQL Server and they've not been already authenticated, they're not part of a trusted group, or they're not a trusted user coming out of Active Directory, then SQL Server is going to say, whoa, wait a minute, dude, you've got to sign in, and it's going to present them a login. So Windows user account is not required. Now the password, username and password that this user types in, obviously has to be passed across the network, because the SQL Server engine has to check that password against its records to see if this user can come in, and then use that to determine where they can go and what they can do while they're in the databases. Now, this password, even though it is passed across the network, is encrypted automatically. Now, in the background, SQL Server is going to generate a certificate, and it's going to do all kind of stuff and encrypt this password. You don't have to worry about that. Just know what's going on. Again, let me reiterate. In all the documentation and everything you're going to see, and in the real world, Windows Authentication mode is the safest. It's the most secure. In the real world, the way we actually use our databases, a lot of times that won't solve all of our needs, and so we'll have to go to SQL Server specific login. So that's your two authentication modes. You're going to be asked to choose which authentication mode when you install SQL Server, and then later you can go change this. So just want you up to speed on the authentication modes and how you can use them and what the ramifications are of each.